The November wind in Billings had a sharp, dry bite. It carried the smell of scorched earth and that faint tang of cow manure that just hung in the air. The auction yard sat alone in a bare, forgotten field. The grass was long gone, trampled to the roots, replaced by dust thick enough to swallow your boots whole. People packed themselves around old wooden benches, gnawing on jerky, spitting at their feet, laughing way too loud. A broken-down loudspeaker crackled like it had asthma, barking out bids over the noise. Metal bars clanged against rusted gates. Cattle bawled as they were dragged away, their cries mixing with raspy voices yelling over one another. "Who's got 500? 500? Let's go!" It was just another morning here. Rough, dry, and absolutely heartless. This wasn't a place for feeling. It was a place for numbers. What animal could still breed? Which one had enough muscle to pull a cart? And which one wasn't worth a penny? They didn't come here to care. They came to buy and walk away. Then Star walked out. The gate creaked open, and from a patch of shadow he limped into the light. Thin legs carried a body that looked like it had barely survived something awful. His fur was clumped and dirty, dull like ash. One back leg dragged behind with almost no strength left. Around his neck was a scar, a brutal ring, as if a red-hot chain had once been fused into his skin. His chest was sunken in, ribs poking through like tree roots in dry soil. Star didn't bark, didn't whimper, didn't growl. He just stood there, still, straight ahead. Like this whole awful scene was something he'd already lived through 100 times before. The crowd started whispering. "That thing still breathing? Put it down already. Probably got something nasty." But Star didn't move, didn't flinch. Just a tiny tremble in his legs under the weight of so many cold eyes. A beam of sunlight broke through a crack in the tin roof and hit the dusty floor, landing square on Star's face. And in that spotlight, he stood right on the edge between being alive and being forgotten. No begging, no pleading for pity. Just the way he held himself, fighting the shiver, made the whole place go quiet for just a second. At the back, leaning on a wooden railing, stood a man in a beat-up leather jacket. Hair silvering, falling into his eyes. A faint scar ran down from his jaw to his neck. His name was Jonas Whitaker. No one knew him. No one noticed how long he'd been there. Jonas didn't laugh, didn't move, just watched, and Star watched him back. That amber gaze, silent and steady, locked onto Jonas. Not desperate, not afraid, just ancient, like a memory long buried but never erased. The auctioneer's voice dragged on, more bored than before. "No one? No one wants this one? $30? 20? Then Jonas raised his hand. No words, no bidding war, just his hand in the air, slow, certain, like he'd been waiting for this moment for years. People stirred, someone scoffed. "Who's the nut job, gonna bury it or boil it?" The gavel dropped. "Sold." The sound hit Jonas like thunder from a storm long past. A memory stirred bright metal, a box barely cracked open, and winter fog. A noise in the dark. He remembered. Back then, he used to drive for a shady company that moved dogs marked for behavioral testing. No questions, no names, just crates in the back of his truck. One bitter winter, snow. Thick on the mountain roads, Jonas was driving a run-of-the-mill delivery when he heard its soft scratching. A low, broken whine, like a ghost tapping from the other side of the wall. He pulled over. Snow crunched under his boots as he walked to the back. There it was, a rusted, sealed metal crate, smeared with filth and dried blood. No label, nothing to say what was inside. But when Jonas cracked it open just a few inches, those eyes stared out. Amber, blood-specked, terrified. Alert, but silent. Not a sound, That stare went straight through him, into places Jonas hadn't let anyone reach. He closed the door, didn't say a word, didn't do a thing, just turned and walked away. It was just one crate in hundreds, but it was the only one he never forgot. And now, here, in this dusty yard, those same eyes were staring at him again. Jonas stepped toward Star, slowly, carefully, like he was walking back to some broken part of himself he'd left behind years ago. Star didn't move. One ear twitched as Jonas crouched down to his level. He didn't reach, didn't stroke, just sat, eye to eye. "Hey." His voice barely broke the air, just a breath, like something exhaled from deep inside his chest. Star tilted his head, a small movement, but it carried so much. Jonas held his hand out, hovering just off Star's shoulder, not touching, just waiting. Then Star leaned in. Light, barely there. His shoulder brushed Jonas's hand without no fear, no hesitation. And they stayed like that. Someone in the crowd captured the moment on an old phone. The clip was blurry, full of static, but it showed one man sitting in a patch of dusty sunlight and one starving dog resting gently against a hand that never tried to take. That video didn't go viral. Not yet. But it would. Because in a place no one would remember, two souls that the world had given up on chose not to give up on each other. Jonas never knew why he raised his hand. But in that noisy, dusty yard, something inside him finally answered a call he'd ignored too long. This time he didn't turn away. The wind died down after the gavel fell. But the loudest thing Jonas heard was the rhythm of Star's heartbeat. Silent. Steady. Calling him home. Star was still standing there, still staring at Jonas. But this time his eyes weren't just full of pain. Something else had returned, like the morning sun melting frost. Maybe trust, or at least a flicker of hope. Jonas adjusted his collar not from cold, but because his heart was thudding in a way he hadn't felt in years. The auction yard faded. The whispers blurred. All that remained was Star and the choice not to let the past repeat. He walked away, and Star followed. No leash, no commands, just quiet steps under soft, slanted sunlight. Together they left the dust and the stares and the cruel laughter behind. Ahead was nothing but a long dirt road. Behind them, the ghosts they never named. But Jonas knew today something had started to heal. And Star, with nothing but that look in his eyes, had already forgiven him, even before Jonas knew he needed it. From a distance, a gust of wind kicked up the dust, brushing Jonas' coat and the rough fur on Star's back. Two shadows drifted away from the auction yard, toward where the sun hadn't yet set. A child watched them go, fingers curled around a camera. He whispered, "Mom, did he just save that dog?" His mother didn't speak, just nodded, eyes still, following the two fading figures. And somewhere online, a short clip went live with one simple caption. A moment no one expected, but no one would forget. Later, the old truck rumbled to life. The tires rolled slowly across the dirt. Star lay curled in the back seat, tucked beneath thick blankets. Jonas glanced into the mirror, and there Star was, looking back at him. Not scared, not uncertain, just still. For the first time in years, Jonas smiled. Not because he won, but because finally the old cabin sat deep in a mossy valley near Laurel, tucked between tall grass and thick pine woods where the trails gave way to silence. Its roof, slanted and sagging, was blanketed in moss and vines, looking more like a memory left behind than a home anyone still lived in. The walls, made of weathered timber, had long since cracked with age. The cold crept in through every seam, every grain soaked with winter's breath. Time hadn't healed anything here. It just layered on more stillness. Wind slipped through the cracks in the door, whistling long and low, like someone breathing through clenched teeth. The air inside was thick with the scent of old ash from the fireplace, rotting wood, and damp pine needles. The darkness didn't feel scary, just familiar, like an old blanket wrapped around a soul that had wandered too far. Jonas parked the truck beneath the biggest pine at the end of the dirt path. No sign, no directions. This was the place he used to run to after the nightmares, after nameless jobs and faceless clients. The cabin had never felt like home. It was more of a hiding place somewhere to forget. But today, Jonas wasn't bringing memories or grief. He was bringing something else, a life, a soul, a dog who had lost the one thing nobody talks about until it's gone: trust. Star jumped out of the truck without a sound. No bark, no whine, no curious glance around. His limping paws touched the mossy ground like he was stepping into a place that once hurt him. Jonas opened the cabin door. A shaft of light from the late afternoon sun cut through the dusty air, casting long lines across the pale wooden floor. Star didn't sniff around like other dogs might. He walked straight in, like he'd been here before. He padded to a corner near the fireplace, circled once, and curled into a tight ball, eyes open, staring straight ahead. He didn't make a sound, just existed. Quiet and raw. Jonas placed a clean bowl of water and some soft smoked meat near Star's nose. Star didn't touch it. His eyes stayed wide open, but it was like he wasn't really seeing the room. Or Jonas. It was a look not of fear, but of searching, as if trying to piece together a memory long shattered. Those first few nights were filled with a silence that felt almost haunted. No barking, no scratching, not even a breath too loud. Just the ticking of the old wooden clock, dragging its weary beats like the final breaths of a forgotten past, and the crackle of firewood in the hearth. Jonas tried everything: warm milk, soft rice, blankets pulled near the flames. He even fed Star by hand, gently, spoon by spoon. But Star would pull back, quietly. No growling, no resistance, just refusal. He wouldn't accept anything that came from a human hand. Jonas didn't get angry, but deep inside, something stung. A kind of rejection he wasn't prepared for from a creature just as broken as he was. Each morning, Jonas would find Star sleeping in a different corner, always further away, always deeper into the shadows. Star didn't sleep much, but he never really closed his eyes either. They stayed half open, always watching, as if falling asleep meant waking up somewhere worse again. One night, Jonas was reading by the fire when he caught Star staring past him, at something behind. He turned to see the old metal coat hook by the door swaying in the wind, making a soft clinking sound. Star bolted into a corner, trembling hard, a low, choked whine stuck in his throat. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. It was relieving, not revival, not rebirth, but reliving pain. Chains, screams, darkness no one had ever tried to understand. The fire cast Star's shaking shadow against the wall. It stretched long and thin like the shape of a trauma that never really left. Jonas stood, walked over, unhooked the old metal piece, and tossed it into a wooden box in the corner. The room went quiet again. But it was a different quiet now. Not the kind that pushes you away. The kind that asks if maybe, just maybe, two haunted things can share the same space. One man, one dog, both with scars too deep for names, but clear enough to recognize in each other. Later that night, Jonas added another log to the fire. The glow warmed the room, flickering over the floor like sunlight on old wounds. Star was asleep, sort of his ears still twitching. And inside Jonas, something stirred. It started with a small sound. Not in the room, however, the memories were deeply ingrained within him. Memories he had buried started bubbling up, that long-ago winter drive. Tires sliding over snow, cold biting through every joint, a crate shifting in the back, a soft whimper swallowed by the howling wind. He hadn't checked it, didn't let himself care. All he'd done was deliver and drive. There was one time he'd opened the wrong crate by mistake. Just a sliver of light, and a pair of amber eyes met his. Wide, desperate, pleading. He'd slammed it shut, because it wasn't his job. That's what he told himself back then. Now he sat in the dark, one hand resting on a rusted chain. The other is bracing the armrest. Star slept near the fire, but his ears still twitched every time the wind sighed. Jonas stared into the flames and saw the truth. Those eyes from years ago, Star's eyes were the same. On the fourth night, Jonas woke suddenly. He hadn't heard anything, but he felt it. Warmth. He looked down. Star had moved closer. The star curled near his feet, back turned but not gone. Not trust, not yet. Just the comfort of human presence, close enough to rest. Jonas didn't move, didn't speak, didn't touch. He just whispered, "It wasn't your fault." "I know." Star didn't lift his head, but his tail tucked in just slightly, and for the first time, Star responded to something that wasn't a threat. It was small, but it was real. It was akin to a long-shut, rusted door, which shifts slightly when someone knocks, yet remains motionless without moving. And to Jonas, that tiny flick of a tail after hundreds of quiet nights of nothing felt like an answer. The next morning, Jonas stepped out onto the porch. Fog hung low. The wind carried the smell of moss, pine, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. The cabin hadn't changed, but everything else had. Because from that day on, the place he used to run from became the place he could finally return to. That morning, the forest of laurel was still half asleep beneath a blanket of thick mist. The trees whispered gently overhead, their leaves stirring like ancient curtains drawn across a long-forgotten memory. The silence was so complete that each step Jonas took over dry branches echoed like time snapping underfoot. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth, resinous pine, and something older, something unnamed, lingering between the past and now. Jonas didn't know why he turned off the path that day. The northern trail into the woods was a place he had always avoided. Not because it was dangerous, but because it held things he wasn't ready to face. Memories, helplessness, and that nameless fear that lived in all the things he'd left behind. But when he saw Star standing on the cabin porch, head tilted toward the tree line, as if listening for something deep in the woods, he understood. This was no longer a journey he'd take alone. They walked without a word. The shadows of man and dog stretched long across the damp forest floor, weaving through shafts of faint sunlight that pierced the canopy above. Every step Star took was grounded, deliberate, and every few dozen paces Star would pause, turn back, and glance at Jonas with just a flick of amber eyes, asking, "Still with me?" Jonas nodded, never needing to speak it out loud. He was starting to realize something. Star didn't need saving. Star needed someone willing to walk beside him. No commands, no pulling, no pushing, just presence. And somehow that was enough. The trail twisted and rose, lined with roots that jutted from the ground like hands reaching up from the soil. At times the wind picked up and spun leaves into the air, blanketing their path in rustling gold. But Star never slowed. His gray coat shimmered with dew, like a suit of silver armor, and his stride carried no trace of captivity. He moved like a soul who had already survived his storm. By the time they reached the creek where the water whispered over moss-covered stones, Jonas noticed it clearly. Star was leading, not charging ahead, but clearing the way with a freedom that had once been stolen. And without a word between them, Jonas felt his chest loosen, as if every step Star took was gently healing something inside him, carving through the invisible wounds that still ached in silence. A brittle branch cracked underfoot. Jonas froze. Star stopped too, ears alert, eyes turning back. For a few seconds they just looked at each other. Then they moved forward again. No signals, no words, just shared breath, shared rhythm. And in that stillness, Jonas knew. They weren't just walking. They were remembering. Together. From afar, the sun began to pierce through layers of thin cloud. A single beam of golden light broke through and touched the dew gathered on Star's fur. In that fleeting moment, Jonas no longer saw a dog who had been abandoned. He saw a warrior, silent, resilient, and slowly finding his way back to who he once was. That morning, the forest of laurel still seemed half asleep beneath a thick layer of mist. The treetops rustled softly, like ancient curtains drawn over an old memory. The silence was so complete that every crunch of Jonas's boots on dry twigs echoed like the snapping of forgotten time. A light wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth, pine sap, and something older still, the smell of things unnamed. Jonas didn't know what compelled him to turn. The path, the narrow trail into the northern woods, was one he had always avoided. Not because it was dangerous, but because it held too much. Memories he wasn't ready for, feelings of powerlessness, and a fear with no name, tied to everything he had once walked away from. But that morning, when he saw Star standing on the porch, head tilted toward the edge of the forest, as if listening for something just beyond reach, he understood. This wasn't his journey alone anymore. They walked without speaking. Their shadows stretched long across the damp ground, weaving between faint beams of light filtering through the canopy. Every step Star took was grounded and sure. He didn't need to look back, but every so often he paused, turned, and met Jonas's eyes as if to ask, "Still with me?" Jonas gave a small nod. No words were needed. He was beginning to understand that Star didn't need saving. Star needed someone to walk beside him, someone who wouldn't pull, wouldn't push, and wouldn't command. Just walk. Just be. That presence, simple and steady, was enough. The path twisted through the woods, roots curling up like fingers reaching from the earth. At times the wind rose and sent waves of dry leaves swirling into the air, momentarily blinding the trail. But Star never slowed. His dark gray coat glistened with morning dew like silver armor. And the way he moved held no trace of captivity, only the quiet strength of a soul who had outlasted his own storm. When they reached a narrow path along the creek where the water whispered against moss-covered stones, Jonas realized something. Star wasn't just walking ahead. He was leading. Not with dominance, but with a kind of grace, shaped by freedom that had once been stolen. And even though neither said a word, something inside Jonas began to soften. It felt like every step Star took was gently unwinding the knots inside him, the kinds of wounds no one else could see, but that still hurt all the same. A dry branch cracked beneath Jonas's boot. He froze. Star stopped too, ears upright, eyes locking back. For a few seconds they stood still, watching each other. Then they moved on. No signal, no cue, just a shared breath, a shared rhythm. And from far off, the sun reached down. A shaft of warm light broke through the clouds, catching the fine dew on Star's coat. It shimmered like gold over gray, and for a brief, aching moment, Jonas saw him clearly. Not as a stray, not as a survivor, but as something more. A warrior, quiet, unbreakable, and walking, step by step, toward himself again. From the moment their two shadows walked side by side through the forest, something inside Jonas began to shift. He was no longer the guide. He was the one learning to observe. They ventured deeper into the heart of Laurel, where the trees grew tighter together and the air thickened with the scent of rotting leaves. A large boulder blocked the path, forcing them to veer off and follow the edge of a shallow creek, slick with patches of moss. Jonas sat down against an old pine trunk, catching his breath, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. Star remained on his feet, ears perked high, eyes scanning the woods like a silent sentinel. Neither spoke, yet both could hear the language of the forest, rustling leaves, distant bird cries, and then something else. A low, guttural growl rolled out from the thicket across the stream, sharp and menacing. Jonas turned instantly, and then it emerged, a massive stray dog lunging from the shadows. Its fur bristled dark gray and wild, eyes red with fury, lips curled back over bared teeth. A wolf-dog hybrid, maybe. A creature abandoned between instinct and memory, half wild and half forgotten. Jonas started to back away, but Star moved first. No bark, no growl, just one step forward, placing himself between Jonas and the threat. His back arched, fur raised, legs braced solid against the earth, his head lowered, eyes locked on the intruder. In that moment, the cabin, the forest, even the past faded. There were only two beings and the raw instinct to survive. The wild dog lunged. The sound tore through the clearing like ripping canvas. But Star didn't flinch. He sprang, twisting mid-air with a fluid grace, dodging the attack and landing a precise bite at the side of the other dog's neck. It wasn't meant to kill, just enough to throw the opponent off balance. The fight lasted no more than 10 seconds, but to Jonas it stretched like slow motion. Every movement Star made was clean and deliberate. No panic, no rage, only the cold precision of a creature who had faced fear before and learned how to master it. The stray yelped, spun, and fled into the deeper forest. Star didn't chase. He stood his ground, ears still up, breath heavy and controlled. Then he turned. His eyes met Jonas's. Jonas stood frozen, not from fear, but from awe. For the first time he understood the true power in Star, not in the strength of his bite, but in the choice not to continue the violence. That was the strength of someone who had endured. And now choose to rise without inflicting more pain. The wind moved gently through the trees again. Star walked back toward Jonas. No pride, no seeking praise, just presence, a quiet kind of companionship. And Jonas, wordless, placed a steady hand on Star's shoulder. Once more, nothing needed to be said. The battle had passed. But inside Jonas, something was only just beginning. Star's last glance back held no fear, no arrogance. That look clear, calm, and unwavering rooted Jonas to the ground. The fight was over, but its echo inside him was like an old roar returning. Not about survival, but about reclaiming something once lost. On the path home, the forest seemed changed. No longer a labyrinth of twisted shadows, no longer a hiding place for fear. It had become a quiet stage, where two souls had walked through an unseen trial and come out the other side not untouched, but transformed. Jonas no longer walked ahead. He moved beside Star now, as if everything before had only been the prelude to something real, the beginning of true companionship. The sun had risen higher. Light streamed through the treetops in golden ribbons, falling randomly across Star's back. His fur was still damp with dew, streaked with bits of soil and leaf, yet his steps carried a quiet grace. Star didn't glance back, didn't check. Every stride felt calm, as if the forest had never held shadows at all. Jonas tilted his head slightly, watching him. It wasn't pity anymore, nor sympathy. It was admiration, pure and unhidden. In that moment, Jonas realized something he hadn't before. He had believed all this time that Star needed him to heal. But in truth, it was Jonas who had been mending, piece by piece, held together by a creature who had once been even more broken than he was. They crossed through a low clearing, the grass brushing against their boots and paws. The sound of wind tapping against the pines echoed in the distance. Neither said a word. But in the silence, each breath, every pause in their walk, and the subtle tilt of Star's head became a language of its own, simple, but deeply real. Jonas stopped beneath an old elm, a place he used to end his walks when he went alone. He eased himself down at the base, back against the rough bark, eyes gently closed. Star didn't lie down. He remained standing just half an arm's length away, ears high, eyes fixed on something distant. The wind brushed across their shoulders, and for the first time, Jonas didn't whisper to himself, but aloud. "You don't need me to protect you," he said. "I'm the one who needs to learn how to survive again." Star didn't reply, but his tail gave a faint movement, not a wag of joy, but a quiet signal, a sign that he heard and understood. When they reached the cabin porch, the wood glowed in the late afternoon sun. It no longer looked like a place to hide. Just as Jonas was about to step up the stairs, he stopped. A man stood there, broad-shouldered, weathered face marked by years. In his hand, a piece of paper with the corners worn and smudged. And at the center was Star. Star froze too, no whine, no bark, but his body stiffened, back arched, and ears locked forward. Then came a low growl, soft, brief, but tight as a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Jonas glanced at Star, then turned to the man, and in that moment, he knew. The past wasn't finished, and a new chapter was about to begin. Not just for Star, but for him as well. The wind rolled through Laurel again, carrying a chill that hinted at something unnamed, not yet spoken. After that quiet growl, the porch seemed to freeze in place. Jonas didn't move. Star didn't either. Only the stranger took one step closer, his boots tapping lightly on the wooden boards. He wasn't tall, but there was strength in his gait. He stopped just a few paces away, holding the paper at chest height. It was torn at the edge, but the image was clear. A younger Star, a different coat, a different look in his eyes. And in the corner of the page, printed at a slant, were the words, "Missing evidence in case file R09411, request for return." Jonas froze. Something inside him rang out like an alarm bell. It wasn't just the paper in the man's hand. It was the look in his eyes, a gaze that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Cold, controlled, familiar. "That dog," the man said, voice dry and low, "used to belong to a special unit." He wasn't a pet. He was evidence. Star didn't look away. The fur along his spine bristled, ready for something. But he didn't move. He just stood there, as if waiting for a trigger. "My name is Harlan Vex," the man continued. "I used to work in the advanced K-9 conditioning program for the state of Wyoming. Star, or K217, as listed in the records, was part of our high-tolerance endurance trials. He disappeared along with a missing transport in 2020. The words hit Jonas like a drop in his chest. He didn't need to ask more. The cargo, the metal crate, that broken, muffled cry, and that look. "Who sent you?" Jonas asked, his voice rough. "We've been using thermal imaging from local satellites," Harlan replied. "Recently picked up unusual signals from a biological unit matching Star's profile. I came to confirm." Star stepped back slightly, ears still alert. But now his eyes had shifted, not toward Harlan. Toward Jonas, and Jonas understood. It wasn't fear. It wasn't an apology. It was a choice. Once again, Star was choosing to stay in the one place he believed he could be himself. "He's not anyone's property anymore," Jonas said, voice steady. "He's not evidence. He's not a case number. His name is Star. And if you're here to take him back, you're in the wrong place." Harlan's hand tightened around the flyer. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. But if the old organizations find out, they won't let it go. Some things aren't allowed to disappear." "And some things," Jonas said, eyes never leaving Star, "should never be owned." A chill swept across the porch again. Harlan folded the flyer slowly and slid it into his coat pocket. He looked at Star one last time, not with the eyes of a handler, but like someone watching a door quietly close. "Keep him safe," he said under his breath, then turned away. His footsteps faded behind the old pines, leaving the porch in silence. Star stepped forward just once toward Jonas. His tail gave a slight movement, no growl, just a long, steady breath. And once again, two living souls stood side by side. No one is chasing. No one is running. Only one choice remained. And from that moment on, Jonas understood. The past could always catch up, but the present that was something they could choose to hold together. The afternoon wind swept through the laurel woods, carrying with it a chill that hinted at something unnamed. After the low, warning growl from Star, the entire porch seemed to freeze in place. Jonas didn't move. Neither did Star. Only the stranger took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boots brushing dust across the old wooden boards. The man wasn't particularly tall, but his gait was solid. He stopped a few feet from Jonas and Star, still holding the paper raised at chest level. The flyer was weathered, one corner torn, but the image in the center was unmistakable. It was Star at another time, with different fur and a different look in his eyes. Printed across the top corner in slanted block letters were the words, "Missing evidence in case number R-09-411, request for immediate return." Jonas stiffened. Inside him, something rang sharp and urgent, not just because of what was written, but because of the man's eyes to eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Cold, contained, and disturbingly familiar. "That dog," the man said, his voice low and dry, "once belonged to a special unit. He wasn't just a pet. He's evidence." Star didn't look away. The fur along his shoulders bristled, his whole body poised for something unseen. But he didn't leap forward. He simply stood there, still and watching, like he was waiting for the truth to surface. "My name is Harlan Vex," the man continued. "I was part of the high-intensity K9 training program in Wyoming. Star, or, as he's listed in the records, K217, was part of our endurance protocol. He disappeared along with a shipment that went off-grid in 2020. As soon as he said it, Jonas felt the floor drop out inside him. He didn't need more details. The shipment, the steel crate, the muffled howling, and those eyes. "Who told you to come here?" Jonas asked, his voice rough and dry. "We've been using localized thermal imaging from our satellite grid. Recently, there's been an irregular heat signature matching a biological imprint near this elevation. I came to verify." Star took a step back. His ears were still perked. But now his gaze had shifted not toward Harlan, but toward Jonas. And Jonas understood. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't fear. It was a choice. One more time, Star was choosing to stay in the one place he believed he could still be whole. "He doesn't belong to anyone anymore," Jonas said, the words deliberate and heavy. "He's not evidence. He's not a case number. His name is Star. And if you're here to take him back, then you're lost." Harlan's fingers tightened around the flyer. I'm not here to make a scene, but if the old networks find out, they won't just let it go. Some things can't be left behind." "Some things," Jonas replied, eyes still fixed on Star, "were never meant to be owned." The breeze rustled again, stirring the dust along the porch. Harlan slowly folded the flyer and slid it into his coat pocket. He looked at Star one last time, not like a handler sizing up an asset, but like someone staring at a door that had finally closed. "Keep him safe," he said quietly, then turned and walked away. His footsteps faded behind the trees, swallowed by the silence of the woods. Star stepped forward just a little toward Jonas. His tail gave the faintest motion. No growl, just a steady breath, long and slow, and once again 2 lives stood side by side. No one chasing, no one is fleeing. Only one thing left between them: choice. A cold wind swept once more across the porch. Harlan folded the flyer and slipped it into his coat pocket. He looked at Star one last time, not like a man giving orders, but like someone watching a door quietly close behind him. "Keep him safe," he said softly, then turned and walked away. His figure disappeared beyond the old pines, leaving the porch in stillness. Star stepped forward, moving closer to Jonas. His tail gave a small, silent sway. No growl, just a deep, steady breath. And once again, 2 living beings stood together. No more being hunted, no more running. What remained between them was choice. And in that moment, Jonas understood. The past might catch up, but the present, that was something they could hold on to, together. That morning, autumn had painted the small town streets in golden light. The maple trees were shedding their leaves like quiet sighs, spreading a bright yellow carpet beneath the footsteps of early walkers. The air was warm, yet carried the faint scent of parting, the scent of a season, slowly closing its doors. Jonas walked Star down the main street, his pace unhurried. Star trotted beside him, steady and silent, moving like he belonged to these nameless streets, no leash, no commands, just 2 souls sharing a peaceful morning. The town was just waking up to the gentle clinking of coffee cups from open cafes, the quiet voices of people heading to work, and the scent of fresh brew mixing with warm pastries floating on the breeze. Jonas stopped in front of a small roadside cafe, one he visited every week. He nodded to the owner, a silver-haired man with a kind smile, then stepped inside. Star remained on the sidewalk, sitting beside an old wooden bench faded by years of sunlight. He sat straight, his eyes trained on the road, like he was keeping watch over something precious. His gaze followed the passing crowd, not with suspicion, not with tension, just a calm, awake presence. A little girl, no older than 6, came skipping across the street, hugging a red cloth ball, giggling as she tossed it gently from hand to hand. Her mother, at the register behind her, turned and called out, "Don't go too far!" But the warning hadn't even finished when a sharp car horn rang out from the corner, fast, shrill, and full of alarm. The red ball slipped from the girl's hands and bounced into the street just as traffic began to build. Her tiny legs dashed after it without hesitation, guided only by instinct. And at that very second, a gray delivery truck came speeding around the curve, its headlights catching the windshield like a flash of fire. The tires screamed against the pavement. A piercing screech tore through the quiet morning. Everything seemed to freeze in that breathless moment, and from the edge of the sidewalk, Star sprang to life. There was no bark, no growl, just one clean motion, a leap, like an arrow cutting through the narrow space between danger and the life that hadn't yet learned fear. No one in the crowd could move fast enough to stop what was happening. They only watched, mouths open, as the gray blur of fur launched into the street, slicing through time and sound, aiming straight for the heart of the storm. The truck hadn't stopped. Its tires screeched, sliding across the asphalt and leaving behind the bitter stench of scorched rubber. And in that breathless second, right in front of the speeding grill, Star made it. Still glowing under the pale gold of the morning light, still holding that same steady, focused gaze, Star bit down on the collar of the little girl's shirt, pivoted, and with one powerful motion spun her out of danger and onto the sidewalk. It all happened in the blink of an eye. The child hit the ground crying, but she was whole. Safe. And Star stood there, right in the heart of the road, shrouded in the haze of burnt smoke. All four legs braced. His breath was heavy, his eyes searching for Jonas. That was the moment the world started paying attention. But for Star, it was just a moment that needed to happen. And so he made it happen. In a heartbeat suspended between screeching rubber and held breath, Star had launched himself into the street like a streak of silver through fog. But what had just taken place didn't end there. That act, that raw instinct, had pierced something far deeper than flesh or air. It had reached into the heart of a town slowly numbed by indifference. And from that second forward, everything began to shift in ways none of them could have predicted. Star stood still in the middle of the street, smoke curling around him like battlefield mist. The little girl clutched her red cloth ball, sobbing into her mother's arms. The block had gone silent. No one could quite believe what they had just witnessed. A few people started pulling out their phones, not to call for help, but to capture what they already knew would never repeat. Jonas rushed forward, dropped to his knees, and wrapped his arms tightly around Star. It wasn't the embrace of a pet owner. It was the grasp of one soul holding on to another, both of them shaken from the razor-thin line between life and loss. A traffic officer arrived on the scene, ready to shout for the crowd to clear the street, but he stopped short. His eyes met Star's. There was no begging in that stare, no tremble, only a steady, quiet presence. Deep, grounded. "I got it! I got the whole thing!" A teenage voice stammered behind them, holding up a phone with trembling hands. That one sentence sparked a wave. The video spread fast, edited, slowed, and paired with soft music. Then it rolled like an unstoppable tide across every platform. Four-legged warrior, the nickname, began to appear everywhere. News anchors recounted the story each evening. Footage of Star was looped on national broadcasts with headlines like, "Hero Dog Saves Child from Oncoming Truck." Special features aired. Witness interviews flooded in. And that now iconic clip of Star standing tall in the middle of the road, eyes unwavering, struck viewers into silence. But for Jonas, as he returned to the cabin that night, none of it made as much sense as the one thing that kept echoing in his chest. It wasn't the fame. It wasn't the rescue. It was that look in Star's eyes. It hadn't said, "I just saved someone." It had said, "I just remembered who I am." As the sun dipped behind the trees, Star lay on the porch, gently licking the dried blood on his paw. Jonas sat beside him, quiet, eyes watching the dirt trail that led back into town. Out there, the numbers were climbing. Views, shares, headlines. But inside the cabin, something else had begun to rise. Not fear. No hesitation. Something softer. Something Jonas hadn't felt in a long time. Something dangerously close to faith. The video was under 30 seconds. It hit TikTok within an hour. The hashtag #, four-legged warrior, shot to the top of the trending list. People everywhere were reposting it with captions like, "If today made you lose faith in the world, watch this." Thousands of views turned into millions. Local news started covering it with headlines like, "Dog saves child in a split second." And then came the national media. But they weren't looking for the little girl. They were looking for Star. The media storm came crashing in, as if it were the only natural response to an act too pure, too brave to be ignored. Footage from multiple angles surfaced. Emotional music was layered in. Titles flashed across the screen. Everyday hero. Some called Star an angel on 4 legs. Others said he was a symbol of quiet courage. Jonas didn't use social media. But he knew something was happening when he saw 2 vans with network logos parked near the narrow trail to his cabin. A young reporter stood at the wooden door, microphone in hand, eyes bright with anticipation. In the other hand was an iPad, frozen on the frame of Star turning his head to look at Jonas after saving the child. The caption below read, "More than instinct." From behind the curtain, Jonas watched. Star lay by the doorway, head resting on his paws, expression unchanged, as if none of this had anything to do with him. But Jonas knew. The storm had come. And this time, it wouldn't be easy to outlast. He sat beside the window, cradling a mug of cold coffee. Star rested nearby, the cut on his leg now wrapped in clean cloth. It wasn't deep, just a scratch. But to Jonas it felt like a quiet reminder of the price of choice. He remembered the night he brought Star home. The trembling figure huddled in a corner of the cabin, shadows clinging to every inch of him. That night, Jonas had crouched down and whispered, almost under his breath, "No one's going to touch you again." A simple promise, but one that built an invisible wall between Star and the world. Now, with cameras inching closer and strangers reaching for interviews, Jonas found himself wondering, had that promise been protection, or had it been possession? Was it merely a covert measure to shield Star from public scrutiny? He wasn't afraid of the media. What terrified him were the questions. The quiet, innocent questions that had the power to dig up a life he'd tried to bury. He didn't want anyone learning about the years he worked for a shady transport unit, where dogs like Star were listed on forms with no names. He didn't want to admit he'd signed off on shipments without asking what they contained. But then Star raised his head, gently placed it on Jonas's lap. No demand, no hesitation, just presence. And in that moment, every fear softened. There were no headlines in Star's gaze, no judgment, just one quiet question that lingered in the silence between them. Are the good things worth telling? Jonas stood, walked to the door. Star followed. No command needed. When Jonas gripped the handle, the hinges creaked like an old memory breathing out one last time. He opened the door, not to step into the spotlight, but because Star had shown him something deeper, that some truths, if never spoken, don't just disappear. They become wounds that never stop aching. Jonas rose to his feet, walked toward the door. Star stayed close, every step silent and sure. When Jonas turned the old handle, the rusty hinge let out a long, aching creak like the past itself groaning open. He opened the door, not to be seen. But because Star had taught him something no one else ever could. Some truths, if left untold, don't fade. They fester. They become wounds that never stop bleeding. The door had barely been open 5 minutes when the air erupted with the rapid-fire flashes of cameras, flickering like lightning in a summer storm. Jonas didn't step out onto the lawn. He stayed right there on the wooden porch, one hand resting lightly on Star's shoulder, like an anchor for both of them. Below the steps, lenses aimed like searchlights, eyes darted, voices buzzed. A young reporter raised her hand, firing off questions in a breathless rush. "Are you the owner of the dog in the video? Can you tell us more about him?" Just days ago, Jonas had believed this cabin life would be the final wall between his past and the present. But the moment Star leapt into the street, clamped his jaws on a child's collar, and pulled her from the path of a speeding truck, something shifted. A door was opened. one that could never quite be closed again. And in Star's eyes, in that moment, there was no plea for recognition. Just the quiet certainty of a soul who knew the worth of his own choice. Jonas didn't answer right away. Star sat still beside him, perfectly calm. No command needed, no signals exchanged. Jonas looked down at Star, then raised his head. His voice was steady, almost soft. "His name is Star," Jonas said, "and I don't think I'm his owner. I think I'm just the one who found him when he needed someone. And maybe I needed him too." The reporter hadn't expected that kind of answer, but she didn't stop. Another voice followed up quickly, louder, more pointed. "How does a dog act like a trained soldier? Can you tell us more about his past?" Jonas paused again. The wind stirred lightly through the pines. Star remained still, but his ears twitched, sensing the weight of what hung in the air. Jonas tilted his head slightly, drew a deep breath, and gave the smallest nod as if granting himself permission to open a door he'd sealed long ago. "Star didn't used to be Star," he began. "He was a number, a test subject, a living tool locked in cages and trained for endurance. I didn't hurt him directly, but I was the one behind the wheel, delivering sealed crates I was told not to ask about." Silence. The cameras kept rolling, but the sounds of the forest began to swallow everything else. Jonas went on, his voice low and deliberate, like tracing old wounds with his fingers. "I once opened the wrong crate by mistake. Inside was a pair of eyes, not wild, not broken, but aware. Aware of fear, of pain, and of silence. I shut that crate fast, but those eyes never left me." He looked down at Star, who was now gazing up at him. He didn't save that girl for applause. He saved her because he knew, if he didn't run, there wouldn't be time. And this time, he chose not to stay silent. 4 days after the video went viral, when the applause still echoed through comment threads and hearts around the country were still stirred by the rescue, an envelope slid under the cabin door. No return address, no signature. Inside was no interview request, no thank you letter. Only a whisper, something soft, something from the dark. The door hadn't been open for 5 minutes when the flash of cameras burst like lightning in a summer storm. Jonas didn't step fully into the yard. He stayed on the porch, one hand resting lightly on Star's shoulder, grounding them both. Below the steps, lenses pointed like searchlights, eyes buzzed with curiosity, and voices tangled in anticipation. A young reporter raised her hand, eager and quick. "Are you the owner of the dog in the video? Can you tell us something about him?" Just days ago, Jonas had believed this cabin would forever shield him from the weight of his past. But the moment Star bolted into the street, gripped the child's collar, and pulled her from the jaws of a speeding truck, something changed. A door swung open, one that could never be closed again. Star's eyes in that moment hadn't begged for applause. They spoke of something else, a soul who knew exactly what his actions meant. Jonas didn't answer right away. Star sat beside him, calm and still. No command was needed. No sign. Jonas glanced down at Star, then back at the crowd. "His name is Star," Jonas said gently, "and I wouldn't say I'm his owner. I'm just someone who met him when he needed someone. And maybe I needed him too." The reporters hadn't expected that kind of answer, but they didn't back off either. Another question came, sharper, faster. "But how did he act like such a trained warrior? Can you tell us about his past?" Jonas stayed quiet for a moment longer. The wind hissed softly through the pines. Star didn't move, but his ears shifted ever so slightly, as if he too could feel the weight of the question. Jonas tilted his head, took in a long breath, and nodded. A quiet agreement with himself to finally open a door long sealed. "Star wasn't always Star," he said. "He was a number, a test subject, a being locked in a cage and treated like a tool. I didn't do it to him directly, but I was the one behind the wheel. I drove the trucks, I delivered the crates. I wasn't allowed to ask what was inside. The crowd fell completely still. Cameras rolled, but the sounds of the forest began to fill the silence. Jonas went on, his voice slow, like walking back through a nightmare. Once, I opened the wrong crate, just for a second, and I saw eyes. Not wild, not crazed. Eyes that knew fear, knew pain, and knew how to be silent. I shut the lid. But those eyes, they've never left me. And when I met Star, I recognized them. It was him. He paused, looking down at Star, who was gazing up at him with the same steady calm that had saved a life. He didn't save that girl to be applauded. He saved her because he knew. If he didn't act, it would be too late. And this time, he chose not to stay silent. 4 days after the video went viral, while the echoes of applause and emotional comments still floated across every corner of the internet, a nameless envelope slipped quietly through the crack beneath the cabin door. It wasn't a fan letter. It wasn't a media request. Inside was a whisper from the dark. Inside the envelope was a single photo. A black and white image, old and blurred at the edges, showing a row of kennels deep in the forest. The air in the picture felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Cold, still, and eerily quiet. On the back of the photo, scribbled in blue ballpoint pen, were only a few haunting words. I'm still alive, and I still remember. It was like someone had reached into Jonas's chest and pulled him backward in time, dragging him through memories he had buried so deep they no longer had names. His shoulders stiffened, and his hands began to tremble slightly, so faintly he barely noticed. In the quiet of the cabin, filled with the scent of old wood and cold ash, the only sound was the wind whispering through the cracks of the door, bearing silent witness to a moment that refused to stay forgotten. Star walked in from the yard, his paws soft against the wooden floor. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just moved toward Jonas with quiet certainty, gently laying his head across Jonas's leg and breathing slow, steady breaths. His ears folded back, and his eyes drifted toward the photo on the table, as if even Star could sense the ghost inside that picture, a ghost neither of them had ever really left behind. Jonas rose suddenly and walked into the back room. The creak of the old cabinet groaned like something half asleep waking again. He yanked it open and rifled through layers of brittle paper until his fingers touched a worn, brown folder. The edges were frayed, the color faded into the texture of dust and time. The smell of old ink and damp paper rose as he opened it. From between the pages, a photo slipped out and fell onto the floor. There it was, the behavioral test site, nestled deep in the northern forest. A place Jonas once drove into under orders. A place he was told never to ask about, never to look, never to remember. But someone out there was remembering for him, not with threats, not with noise, just with a signal, a nudge, to remind him that memory may blur, but truth never really disappears. And now, that truth was knocking, waiting to be told. Jonas sat for hours after that, silent. His mind spun through questions he couldn't answer. Who sent it? Why now? What else was waiting? But one thing he knew for sure. This wasn't just about him anymore. Not about a dog who saved a child or a man who once lost his way. The wind had shifted, and the wind never changes without carrying something new. By the time the sun sank behind the trees, Jonas stood. He didn't lock the cabin. Star rose beside him, padding quietly into the yard like he already understood. No orders were needed. No leashes. Just steps slow, sure, and steady like breathing. If someone out there needs us to tell another piece of the truth, Jonas whispered, eyes locked on the path at the forest's edge. Then this time, we'll tell it all. The wind moved through the treetops, carrying with it the scent of moss, pine, and the coming night. Star looked up at Jonas, and in his eyes wasn't fear or hesitation. It was readiness. That forest ahead had once been the place Jonas ran to forget. But standing there beside Star, with the last light of day casting golden shadows across the damp ground, he finally understood. Some places aren't made for hiding. They're made for returning, for facing the past and speaking its name in the very first light of tomorrow. That morning, the mist hung thick across the forest canopy, draping the cabin like a damp blanket of memories that hadn't been folded away. Everything felt heavier, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something unspoken to rise again. Inside the cabin, Jonas sat quietly in front of the cold fireplace, his eyes locked on a piece of yellowed paper. No signature, no sender, just one line scribbled in fading ink. Meet me at 9 p.m., same place. It had been 4 days since Star appeared on the front pages. 4 days of silence to the outside world, but a storm of noise inside Jonas, stirred further by the black and white photo, that jagged note, and the quietest kind of threat, one carried not in words, but in memories long buried. Tonight, all the questions pointed to one place. Star lay at his feet, staring out through the fogged-up window like he already understood, even before Jonas said a word. There was no plan to be made, no command to give. Some journeys don't begin with a decision. They begin with companionship. Jonas quietly packed a few rations, checked the flashlight batteries, and slid a small knife into his belt. As the sun dipped behind the hills, he stood up. Star rose too, noiselessly. They left through the back door, heading north along a trail that led into a forest Jonas had tried to forget, a path lined not with direction but with avoidance. They moved past twisted turns, dry branches snapping underfoot, where the moon had just pushed through the clouds, casting light on the forgotten trail that wound toward an old, abandoned training compound. The air grew thick with mildew and cold earth, so dense it felt like the forest itself was struggling to conceal its secrets. When Jonas's watch hummed softly to mark 9 p.m., they were already there, standing before a rusted iron gate, once the entrance to a world built to be erased. Jonas and Star reached the old grounds. The gate creaked open with a moan that sounded like the woods themselves whispering a warning. The place was blanketed in dust. As Jonas pushed forward, the hinges screamed softly, their voice brittle and familiar. From a shadowed corridor between the forgotten kennels, a figure stepped out. Tall, worn brown coat, half his face was hidden in the dark. As he drew closer, Jonas saw it, the scar across his hand. A deep, unmistakable cut from the days they used to drive together, hauling whatever the paperwork said not to question. "I figured you'd remember," the man said, his voice like a knife in the quiet. "Remember the eyes in that crate?" Star let out a low, rasped breath. Not a growl, not a charge, but his eyes burned straight through the man, like cutting through decades of dust. "I'm here to say," Jonas replied, steady and low. "I'm going to tell everything. Who lived, who died, who was erased. I'm bringing it all into the light." The man shrugged, turning slowly toward the dark. "Then get ready, Jonas. They're all going to come back." His silhouette disappeared beyond the broken walls, swallowed by the night beyond the compound. Jonas stood still, not from fear, but reverence. Star stood beside him, unmoving, as if he too knew this was not a moment to step forward, but one to absorb. That brief encounter stirred up more than memories. It stirred a reckoning. On the walk home, Jonas didn't speak. Star walked close, never straying. The moonlight, diffused by lingering mist, cast soft rings of light on the damp path ahead, like the fading lines of a story just beginning to be remembered. They didn't need to talk. Their steps were synchronized. Their silence was agreement. The message came in at 3 a.m. No sender. Just one short line. "If you won't speak, we will." Jonas stared at the glowing screen. That cold blue light washed over the stubble on his face, casting long shadows across the exhaustion etched into every line of him. Only a few days ago, he and Star had stood on the cabin porch, surrounded by a crowd of reporters, their voices sharp with curiosity and questions. Back then, the truth was still behind a thin curtain. You could see the light behind it, faint and flickering, but it wasn't time yet. Jonas hadn't found the courage to pull it open all the way. But then came the old photograph, the scrawled handwriting, the silent threat, and the weight of memory crashing back like a wave. And Jonas knew right then if he didn't step forward, the past would come knocking anyway. It wouldn't wait for permission. Outside, the sky was still dark. Star sat by the porch, head held high, ears standing alert. Jonas didn't need to ask. Star felt it too, that subtle shift in the air, like roots pushing through soil after a long storm. The quiet peace they had was slipping away, replaced by something deeper. Something old. Jonas wasn't afraid. Not really. What he felt was closer to a reckoning, like someone who once owed a debt, and now had nowhere left to run. He sat at his old desk, fingers moving slowly across the keyboard. The first name he typed was the one that started it all. The name of the organization he once worked for. The place where dogs were numbered, not named. He dug through the dusty files again, flipping through yellowed papers that were supposed to have been erased from the world. Code numbers, intake dates, behavior charts, brief notes without signatures. And then, tucked between the pages, a photograph. Faded, grainy. Star locked in a cage, staring at the camera. Not scared, not hopeful, just empty. That moment from the other night still haunted him. The old black and white photo, the scribbled words. It wasn't just a memory anymore, it was a call, and Jonas could no longer meet that call with silence. He began pinning the documents to the wooden walls of the cabin, one page at a time, slowly turning the space into something that looked like an investigation board. The kind you'd see in a film, where every thread led back to something buried. The walls started filling up with paper, each sheet a fragment of a forgotten truth. Outside, the early wind slipped through the pine trees, seeping through the cracks in the cabin. The sound it made was strange, cold, almost whispering. Inside, Star watched him quietly, not barking, not pacing, just watching, as if each page Jonas hung was something Star already knew, but could never say. In that low light, Star's eyes weren't lost anymore. They held something steady, a silence that wasn't defeat, but deep companionship. Jonas sorted the files. Star stayed near, one man piecing together what had been shattered, one soul, quiet but loyal, refusing to turn away. Inside that small cabin, the truth was starting to take shape, and Jonas knew now that he couldn't close that door alone. When he posted the first story, not under his real name, but with a made-up one, the response came fast. Some confirmed what he wrote, others added names, and some messages came from the shadows. A quiet promise, sealed by the forest, beneath a sky that had finally let the truth begin breathing again. Jonas knew deep down that what just happened wasn't just a conversation with an old ghost from the past. It was a bell tolling in the distance, shaking loose a truth that had slept far too long. The forest in front of him no longer felt like a place to bury secrets. It was something else now. It was an entrance, a threshold to something not yet born but waiting, a journey of reckoning, of renewal. And Star, without saying a single word, had already chosen to walk that path with him. This time Jonas wasn't going to run. Not anymore. The message came in at 3 a.m. No sender. Just one short line. "If you won't speak, we will." Jonas stared at the glowing screen. That cold blue light washed over the stubble on his face, casting long shadows across the exhaustion etched into every line of him. Only a few days ago, he and Star had stood on the cabin porch, surrounded by a crowd of reporters, their voices sharp with curiosity and questions. Back then, the truth was still behind a thin curtain. You could see the light behind it, faint and flickering, but it wasn't time yet. Jonas hadn't found the courage to pull it open all the way. But then came the old photograph, the scrawled handwriting, the silent threat and the weight of memory crashing back like a wave. And Jonas knew right then if he didn't step forward, the past would come knocking anyway. It wouldn't wait for permission. Outside, the sky was still dark. Star sat by the porch, head held high, ears standing alert. Jonas didn't need to ask. Star felt it too, that subtle shift in the air, like roots pushing through soil after a long storm. The quiet peace they had was slipping away, replaced by something deeper, something old. Jonas wasn't afraid. Not really. What he felt was closer to a reckoning, like someone who once owed a debt and now had nowhere left to run. He sat at his old desk, fingers moving slowly across the keyboard. The first name he typed was the one that started it all. The name of the organization he once worked for. The place where dogs were numbered, not named. He dug through the dusty files again, flipping through yellowed papers that were supposed to have been erased from the world. Code numbers, intake dates, behavior charts, brief notes without signatures. And then, tucked between the pages, a photograph. Faded. Grainy. Star, locked in a cage, staring at the camera. Not scared, not hopeful. Just empty. That moment from the other night still haunted him. The old black and white photo. The scribbled words. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a call. And Jonas could no longer meet that call with silence. He began pinning the documents to the wooden walls of the cabin. One page at a time. Slowly turning the space into something that looked like an investigation board. The kind you'd see in a film, where every thread led back to something buried. The walls started filling up with paper, each sheet a fragment of a forgotten truth. Outside, the early wind slipped through the pine trees, seeping through the cracks in the cabin. The sound it made was strange and cold, almost whispering. Inside, Star watched him quietly, not barking, not pacing, just watching, as if each page Jonas hung was something Star already knew but could never say. In that low light, Star's eyes weren't lost anymore. They held something steady. A silence that wasn't defeat, but deep companionship. Jonas sorted the files. Star stayed near, one man piecing together what had been shattered, one soul, quiet but loyal, refusing to turn away. Inside that small cabin, the truth was starting to take shape. And Jonas knew now that he couldn't close that door alone. When he posted the first story, not under his real name, but with a made-up one, the response came fast. Some confirmed what he wrote, others added names, and some messages came from the shadows. From places Jonas never expected, the responses began to arrive. "I used to work there. I still have a copy. They think no one remembers, but I never forgot." The truth didn't break through in a single burst. It flickered into life, ember by ember, as one voice after another emerged from the silence. Jonas read every word, saved every screenshot, printed each one and pinned it to the cabin wall. Every page became a voice, every piece of proof a heartbeat. Star stayed by his side through it all. Sometimes Jonas would place a hand gently on Star's head, a silent thank you that didn't need to be said. Other times, he just sat there, eyes closed, listening to the hush of the forest wind and the quiet rhythm of Star's breathing beside him. A silent promise between two souls who had once known pain too well. From across the country, more stories began to surface, fragments of the past rising from the shadows, blurred-out addresses, old, fading images. A woman from Minnesota sent him the intake file of a dog who died during one of the earliest test phases. A former driver, just like Jonas, wrote, "I used to think I was just doing a job. Now I know. I was quiet for too long." Jonas began to map it all out, every date and detail, arranging the pages by time. The little cabin, once a place to hide, now stood at the center of an investigation no one had officially started, but everyone who joined in understood. Once the truth has a shape, it cannot be torn down again. And as the first light of morning crept through the window, Jonas knew one thing for sure. They were no longer alone. And this story, once told, would not be silenced. When the first light of morning slipped through the cabin window, Jonas knew they were no longer alone, and the story they had started could no longer be paused. He had felt it the night before, in the quiet weight of Star's gaze and the way the final breeze drifted through the pines. This return wasn't a retreat. It was the first true step into something new. A beginning not forged by escape, but by the will to rebuild, not just for Star, but for every soul that had ever been forgotten. For nights on end, Jonas sat at the wooden table, sketches scattered beneath the warm glow of a single lamp. None of the drawings were final, but each pencil stroke carried something unshakable. Enclosures with no locks, doors that didn't need bolts, recovery spaces free from screams, built with soft earth and morning light. He named the place Hope Ridge, not by coincidence. It was the highest point along the forest's eastern edge, where the sunrise always touched first. Jonas chose it not for ease, but because he believed whoever crossed that threshold first should know exactly where the light begins. After locking away the old files and naming the memories not with fear, but with courage, Jonas knew words alone would never be enough. He needed something tangible, something real. So the next morning, while the fog still curled along the trail, Jonas and Star headed east toward the ridge where day always begins. When Star stepped onto that patch of earth, there was no ceremony, no crowd, no camera lens waiting to catch the moment. Just Jonas, a faded backpack, and a pair of worn hands holding a shovel. Star didn't hesitate. His ears stood tall, his eyes scanned the stillness. Then he looked at Jonas, not asking for direction but offering quiet affirmation. This place was right. Jonas marked the land with wooden stakes, stretching a fence that defined space but never trapped it. He raised a modest A-frame shelter using bamboo and repurposed oilcloth. After each section was built, he would sit beside Star, hand resting gently on his back, as if seeking wordless approval from the first one to call this place home. As the shape of the land slowly emerged, the wind softened. Birds called to each other in the treetops, their songs no longer drowned by hammer strikes. Star lay stretched across the clearing, eyes barely open, ears still attentive. The first sunlight filtered through the branches and settled between Star's front paws, as if even the sun had come to acknowledge him. Not a coincidence. But a moment the world had quietly waited for when a creature once hidden in the shadows became the soul standing at the gate of a world without cages. A world where the door didn't lock behind you. It opened for you. And it meant welcome. That morning, no one called. No one gave notice. But Star woke earlier than usual, his eyes fixed on the winding dirt road that led to Hope Ridge. Jonas, standing by the stove pouring coffee, glanced out and caught that familiar posture in Star's stance, not fear, not excitement, just a quiet attention, like he was listening for the echo of an old promise. By noon, an old silver pickup pulled up at the bottom of the hill. The door creaked open, and an elderly man stepped out. Behind him came a smaller figure, a little girl, maybe 10 years old. They both stood still for a long moment, just looking. Not walking forward, not speaking. As if trying to decide if this place could possibly be real. Jonas stepped outside, Star by his side. The wind carried a hint of fresh grass between them. The man said nothing. He just stared at Star for a long time, then leaned down and whispered something to the girl. She nodded, then slowly approached the unlatched gate. It didn't creak. It didn't swing. It simply stood there, offering no resistance, no demand. The girl looked at Star, then turned to Jonas. "Can I come in?" Jonas didn't answer with words. Star did. He stepped forward and gently touched his nose to the girl's hand. That one gesture, soft, simple, was enough to undo something heavy. She burst into tears, not out of fear, but because, for the first time in months, she didn't feel like a burden. They told Jonas later how she'd survived a fire at a refugee camp, lost her parents, lost her voice. Since then, she'd been shuffled from place to place, each stop met with locked doors and hesitant stares. But not Star. Star didn't ask questions. Star didn't flinch. He just curled up beside her every night and breathed. Jonas understood that gentle touch at the gate wasn't just an invitation. It was a beginning. He set aside a small corner for her, close to the herb garden, where the morning sun reached first and the soil was soft, the kind of place roots could settle again. Each day, Star followed her to the garden. Sometimes he simply watched. Sometimes he pawed at the dirt. Sometimes he just lay by the daisies, eyes half closed, ears tuned to the world. From a distance, Jonas watched as her feet pressed gently into the soil, her hands planting tiny seeds as if rewriting a new language, one that didn't need words, just presence. One afternoon, as Jonas passed by, he saw her whispering something into Star's ear. No one else could hear it, but Star's tail gave a soft wag. Then he tilted his head, like he understood. That moment wasn't just a conversation between a child and a dog. It was a promise that from now on, neither of them would walk alone. And from that moment, Hope Ridge had one more vow stitched quietly into its soil. At twilight, with the sun casting a soft gold across the rooftops of Hope Ridge, Jonas sat on the front step, herbal tea in hand. It had been almost a week since Star had stepped out of the forest beside him to begin something Jonas had never dared name before. A home. And something had shifted since. Hope Ridge no longer felt like a place to hide broken things. It felt like a place where healing happened simply by being. Star rested to his left. The little girl sat to his right. No one spoke, but in that silence, it felt like all the broken pieces had finally found somewhere to rest. From the distance came the sound of footsteps, soft, steady, unhurried. A woman appeared, her silver hair tucked behind her shoulders, a fabric bag slung over one side. She walked straight up to Jonas and handed him a faded photocopy. "I think the girl could stay," she said softly, "but she'll need a guardian, and I can't think of anyone more fitting than you." Jonas looked at Star. Star didn't move, but his ears folded back. Then Jonas turned to the girl. "Do you want to stay?" She nodded. Then, for the first time, With a voice so small it nearly disappeared into the wind, she whispered, "I don't want to go anywhere else." That night, Hope Ridge didn't lock its gate, but this time the gate wasn't just left open to let someone in. It stood as a quiet truth that some wounds don't heal with medicine. They heal through presence. And Star, the quiet warrior, lay there still, eyes on the dirt road. Not to guard, but to welcome. That's when a journey ends, and a real home begins. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with words. It begins with presence, with one gentle touch, one look that says, "I remember, but I forgive." Jonas and Star's story reminds us that even in the deepest silence, where shame, suspicion, or betrayal once lived, redemption can still grow. Whether you're someone who's been accused without proof, or someone carrying guilt from a past you can't undo, know this: you are not alone. If you're living under the shadow of doubt or betrayal, take a breath. Before reacting, gather your truth. Protect your peace, and if you need to, speak up, not to prove yourself, but to free yourself. And if children are involved, protect their innocence. Let love, not revenge, guide your next move. Star didn't need to bark to prove his loyalty, and Jonas didn't need to run forever. In the end, truth stood its ground. Not through rage, but through quiet, unwavering care. Now it's your turn. Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do? Or loved someone who doubted you? Share your story in the comments below. Let others see that behind every scar, there's a soul who kept walking forward. We're listening. You're safe here. And maybe, just maybe, your voice could be the hope someone else needs to hear today.